Well, joining us in the studio for more is Dr. Emmanuel Navon, a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and an international relations expert. And Emmanuel, we'll talk about the diplomatic aspect of this in a second. But if you don't mind me pointing out, you kind of have a personal side to this issue as well.
Well, like many Israelis, my family also came from an Arab country, from Morocco. Now, Morocco is a case actually where Jews were not expelled like they were in Iraq, from Iraq or from Egypt. But of course, most Israelis, or many Israelis, are themselves descendants of refugees from Arab countries who lost their home, lost their property, because there was a double refugee problem between Jews and Arabs in 1948 and in the wars that came after Israel's independence.
Right. Now, what I find interesting is that the movement, you said, the fact of emphasizing the fact there's a double refugee issue, that kind of started more as a grassroots, I would say, almost push among grassroots groups that and the descendants of those refugees. And now it seems to have been adopted by the Israeli government as almost an official diplomatic response to the so-called Palestinian right of return.
Yes, and it's about time, because, you know, there's no precedent in history, there's no basis in international law for applying the status of refugee to descendants of refugees forever. Only the Palestinians and UNRWA do that. They claim that about the 600 or 700,000 refugees, Arab refugees, from the former British Palestine, from Israel in 1948, they claim that after 3 or 4 generations, their descendants are still refugees. They're not. First of all, they include in that the internally displaced person. In other words, Arabs who left their home but remain into the borders of former British Palestine. According to international law, they're not refugees but internally displaced person. They define them as refugees and their descendants. Therefore, an Arab born today in Ramallah, if his great-grandfather had been from the city of Jaffa, where we are right now, he's considered a refugee. He's not a refugee. He's a resident of the Palestinian Authority. He has a Palestinian citizenship. So I think that the fact that today the Palestinian Authority and UNRWA have the completely separate standard, this has to end. And I think Israel is correct to remind the world it's about time that there was, in fact, a double refugee problem, like in most conflicts at the time, such as the partition of British India between India and Pakistan.
Right. I also want to pick up on a point that Ambassador Dan mentioned, which is the UN. Now, that's an Israeli and World Jewish Congress event, but inside the UN, there is an event basically criticizing a decision that the UN made, which, by the way, is also the basis for the claims for Palestinian statehood as well as for the creation of the State of Israel.
Well, so this is something, it's an initiative that the PLO and its allies at the UN started in the 70s to mark the vote of the partition plan as a day of solidarity for the Palestinians. So it's not new. It's been happening for about 40 years. But what's interesting, as you mentioned, it was a General Assembly resolution which is decried today by the Palestinian Authority, by the Palestinians. I mean, they rejected this resolution in 47, and they use it today. They basically deny its validity when they're the one who rejected it. By the way, the resolution of the UN General Assembly on the 29th of November 1947 was a landmark, but it did not create the State of Israel. Right, that's a myth. It was just a recommendation which became moot legally the moment it was rejected by the Arab League. And this resolution also, another important remark is that it spoke about an Arab state and a Jewish state. It didn't speak about a Palestinian state. There was no such a concept at the time because there was no country of Palestine. It's an entity that had been created by the League of Nations, just like the new entities of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, etc. after World War I. So before that, under the Ottoman Empire, there were regions, there were districts, but it's not like, you know, the Palestinians today want us to believe that there was a country of Palestine that existed for thousands of years. No, it was created by the League of Nations in 1922, and the UN recommended separating it into 2 states, one Arab and one Jewish. This was the terminology at the time at the UN.
All right. Well, in Israel, of course, we call this Kaf Tet in November, and it is marked as a landmark date in Zionist history. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for that.
Thank you.